All right, so welcome everybody. I hope you're having a good day in the rain and the fog. It can't be sunny all the time. I actually like the rain and the fog, so I'm good with it. So we're with Sara today, and she's going to be talking to us about Domestic Violence Awareness Month and some of the programs that they have at OASIS. One more thing, if you're not currently getting emails from us and would like to, if you will put your email in the chat as well, so we can make sure to put you on the email list. So Sara, welcome. We're excited to have you. I'll let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role in the community, and then we'll get started.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here with y'all today. I'm sure that judging by the familiar names and faces I'm seeing that some of y'all already know me, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself as well for those of you who don't. My name is Sara. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Director for Community Outreach with OASIS. So I'm really thrilled to be here with y'all, and we're going to discuss intimate partner violence today, and we're going to talk a little bit about DVAM, which is short for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and generally OASIS services and what we can do to help and how folks can get involved. While I work to share my screen, which sometimes takes me a minute, I am gonna just let y'all know that I'm typically a very relaxed presenter. So that basically means that you are welcome to, ask questions, unmute yourself, all of those things. I genuinely believe that this goes so much better when people do ask questions and do, engage. If I ask a question, it's not rhetorical. I do want to hear from y'all. That's really the way that I think that the community education piece works best. And it's lunchtime. So if you're having lunch and you don't want to do that, that's fine too. It won't hurt my feelings. I just want y'all to know that's my style. And because I've got my screen sharing, if somebody could let me know if there are questions or anything in the chat, Denise, I expect that's you, but wanted to say that out loud as well.
Yep, I will watch that for you, Sara.
Thank you so much. And I'll also tell you guys that I get really excited about this this topic and getting the chance to talk about this. So it's likely that I might reach the end and be like, oh my gosh, okay, we have to speed it up. So just bear with me, please. So this is the Intimate Partner Violence 101 presentation that we give to community members. I know that folks on this chat right now probably have a pretty solid understanding of intimate partner violence, being that y'all are so aware of what goes on in our community, you're super engaged, and you are trauma informed. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what intimate partner violence is, but we will discuss that a little bit. Okay. First of all, I want to say this is going to be some sensitive material. Statistics show that probably the majority of us on this Zoom call right now either know someone who has experienced intimate partner violence or maybe even have experienced it ourselves. And so I just want y'all to take care of yourself. If you need to process afterwards, give us a call or anything like that. Just want to put that out there. So I mentioned some statistics earlier just now saying that probably most of us have witnessed somebody who has experienced it or have experienced it ourselves. We all know those national statistics, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. And sometimes when we're talking about national statistics, it gets a little wonky. We have a hard time understanding, well, what does that mean for our community? So I want to share some statistics for specifically OASIS in our previous fiscal year. So this is our July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021 statistics. We served 425 people. That includes 336 adults and 89 of their children. And we provided shelter for 119 people. So y'all can read these statistics and kind of make an understanding yourself. I want to point out though that final statistic, our advocates attended court 405 times with 118 clients. So that just paints a picture of how many times clients may have to go to court in order to obtain a domestic violence protective order or, safety and security for themselves and their children. So that just can paint a picture of how long these processes may take and why we're so concerned about providing judicial systems advocacy for our clients, because this can be a long, arduous, and scary process. So the reason I like to share these statistics instead of just relying on national stats is because it helps us understand the gravity of the situation in our community. So we know that these numbers are not reflective of every single person in the high country who's experienced these forms of violence, but it gets us in a step in the right direction as far as understanding the issue in our community. We also know that not every single person who is experiencing violence is going to come to OASIS. However, the more people who know about our services, the more likely folks who need our services will get them. So that's my thought process in sharing these statistics. So as I mentioned before, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's October. It's my favorite month, so it's great. And I keep saying intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence. Can anybody think of a reason why I'm using the phrase intimate partner violence and not saying domestic violence?
Domestic violence insinuates that it happens like only at a home, whereas it can happen in a multitude of settings.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So I like to use the word or the phrase domestic violence instead of the phrase intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence for that exact reason. Domestic violence does insinuate that it only happens in a home. And specifically, domestic violence is more broad than what we're talking about. Domestic violence might be violence that happens between a parent on a child or between people who are just simply living together. There's really a myriad of options when we're talking about domestic violence. When I'm discussing intimate partner violence, I'm talking about violence that happens between two people who are in an intimate relationship. Those people may or may not be married. They may or may not be a man and a woman. They may or may not live together. So intimate partner violence is a little more broad than sometimes we think of domestic violence. It's also a lot more specific. So that's why I'm using that phrase. And we define intimate partner violence as being a pattern of coercive behavior in which one person attempts to control another through threats of or use of tactics, including physical violence, sexual violence, psychological abuse, and verbal abuse. That is a really long definition, and that I don't expect everyone to remember that long definition. If I could identify some snippets of this definition that I want people to leave with, it's a pattern. So intimate partner violence is not something that happens one time and then it's over. Maybe physical violence happens only once, although that is a little unlikely. But even if the physical episode only happens once, it is highly likely that emotional violence is happening as well throughout the process. So it is a pattern. Additionally, I would like to point out the words coercive and control. So we know that intimate partner violence is about power and control. And it's not about, having an anger management issue or having a substance abuse issue, although those things do exacerbate the issue sometimes. So intimate partner violence is a pattern of behavior, which is rooted in a desire to have control over the other person. So like most forms of violence that are highly stigmatized and oftentimes shame-laden, things like intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and sex trafficking and things like that, there are so many misconceptions around these forms of violence. And misconceptions are very harmful because, as I mentioned before, these forms of violence are stigmatized. They are laden with shame. And for as long as these forms of violence are stigmatized for the victims, it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to end violence or that folks will get the services that they need. What are some misconceptions that you can think of that are related to intimate partner violence specifically? Can anyone think of something that maybe before they learned about this form of violence, maybe they thought themselves?
Well, I didn't necessarily think this, but I think you hear that a lot of women in particular think they deserve that. If they had done it this way, then that wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely. I think a huge misconception is that the survivor has done something to cause the violence. This is a misconception that we hear often within some familial structures or even some specific cultures, because we know that oftentimes when someone learns that someone is abusive, they really want to protect their vision of that person and say, well, that person wouldn't do that if not for a reason, right? So that is a huge misconception. It's very common. Some other misconceptions include that abuse really only happens to certain people. What certain people might I mean?
People who are using.
Right. Yeah, so people who are using substances, other types of people that might refer to as, just women as a whole. We know that intimate partner violence does not only happen to women. Other misconceptions along that line is that it, only happens to certain demographics, right? So other than just women and folks who may or may not use substances, demographics like people who may be living in poverty or people who may be experiencing homelessness. We know that intimate partner violence can and does happen to anyone. That reminds me to put my phone on Do Not Disturb. So we know that intimate partner violence can and does happen to people of any identity. Additionally, on that same note, intimate partner violence can be perpetrated by people of any identity. We often have this idea of the perpetrator as being a man and the victim being a woman. And we know that, statistically speaking, that is often the case. But if we only rely on those statistics, we are missing a huge swath of the population who really could use our services and who, of course, do not deserve violence to happen against them. So breaking down that misconception is key in removing shame and stigma. Some other misconceptions might be that abusers are always, mean, angry, or cruel. And I say that to say that oftentimes folks believe that if someone was abusive, they would know it, that they would just know it because that person would always be that way. We know that's not true. We also know that a misconception is that it's only physical violence. In reality, intimate partner violence is made up of a lot of emotional abuse, verbal abuse, and coercion and threats. And so it's not only physical violence, although that is oftentimes what our society views as being the only unacceptable form of intimate partner violence. And so we'll get into that. Another misconception is that if it's that bad, they would leave. And we know that because of the power and control dynamics, it is not just so easy for a survivor to just pick up and leave. So as I've mentioned several times throughout this presentation already, and will continue to mention, intimate partner violence is about power and control dynamics. So we use this tool, the power and control wheel, to better understand intimate partner violence as a whole concept. So you'll notice that on the outer rings of this wheel, it says physical violence and sexual violence. So again, these are the forms of violence that people can see. We know it's not okay to hit someone else. We know it's not okay to strangle your partner. We know that it's not okay to shove people and things like that. This is what we as a society see externally, and this is what we say, that's not acceptable. Under the surface, though, of these types of violent behaviors is all of these other behaviors that are to obtain and maintain power and control in the relationship. So that's things like emotional abuse. Those are things like using isolation and using economic abuse. In fact, we know that 99% of cases of intimate partner violence incorporate some form of economic abuse. Is there anything that y'all are seeing on this slide, this wheel, that really stands out or is new information for you, or just makes you go,
Nothing that's new to me, Sarah, but one thing that I think, I don't know if you have any information about this being more unique or more prevalent in Boone, but the isolation piece, we have so many like actual isolated. I know I work with people who don't have cars or who live way back somewhere. And so I just feel like, while I know isolation does not necessarily refer to a physical space, I feel like that is kind of prevalent in this area where we do tend to live in more isolated areas.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And isolation absolutely can refer to physical, like geographical location. In my opinion, the things that I like to focus on the most in this scenario is using isolation and using economic abuse. We have seen over the past year and a half with this pandemic, the isolation and the economic abuse pieces really have been sharpened in the abuser's toolkit, so to speak, because of the pandemic and because of the rural nature of our community. So you're absolutely right on the money when you say using isolation is a tactic within rural communities. That is related to things like living really far out. If they do live together and there is only one vehicle for the family or for the relationship, and the abuser takes the vehicle, that is using isolation. That's also related to, calling and seeking help. Do they have access to the internet? Is there phone service? So isolation is certainly about removing the survivor's safety net and their network of people in their community. However, using isolation is also related to being, physically isolated. And so these things,
I only know those things cookies or any sweets at all.
Did you look in the refrigerator?
like
Sorry.
economic abuse, is they are super related to why somebody may not choose to leave an abusive relationship or why they may choose to leave and then return. So after we've seen this power and control wheel, we can better understand why somebody might choose to stay in an abusive relationship. I want to emphasize that the reason that I talk about why someone might choose to stay or return is because it goes back to those misconceptions. If it were that bad, they would leave. That is a statement that people make that really, again, really stigmatizes and shames survivors. And so the whole point of this presentation, not only to educate folks on what this type of abuse looks like, but also so that we can create and foster more empathy for survivors and better understand the survivor experience. So why might somebody choose to stay in an abusive relationship or even return to their abuser?
Money, not having resources to be on their own.
Right. So money and a lack of resources, which again goes back to using economic abuse. It also goes back to using isolation. So resources can include having a strong community around you, somebody who you can stay on their couch, somebody who would pay for a hotel night for you if you're unsafe. So using isolation and using economic abuse is a huge reason why somebody might choose to stay. Definitely a lack of resources. Why might someone choose to stay other than that?
Safer to know where the perpetrator is.
Mm-hmm. So for safety reasons. So knowing where this person is a lot safer than having to watch your back all the time. Additionally, I'm going to build on that, Mary, and say not only physically knowing where that person is, but having a pulse check on how are they behaving? What's their emotional state? Are they using? All of those things are so related. So it may be a safer option. That's another misconception that I did want to bring up. A lot of folks think that leaving is always the safest option for a survivor. We know that eventually it may be the safest option, but it may not be possible in that moment. And so leaving immediately is not always the safest option. So thank you, Mary, for bringing that up as well. Any other reasons why folks could think of that somebody might choose to stay?
People may also stay if there's children involved.
Absolutely. So they may choose to stay because they don't want their children to, go through what could be an ugly divorce, what could be an ugly custody battle. There's also a lot of cultural pressure for married couples who have children to stay together for the kids. So there's a lot of things tied up in children.
Also because the person think irrationalize that the partner could change.
So that's such a good point. We are in relationship with people because we like them. Probably we even love them, or we did at one point. So we probably want our partner just to go back to the way they were when it all started, when things were good. There's that hope that maybe things will get better. Maybe we can salvage this relationship. I don't know about y'all, but I have never gone through a breakup and been like, that was a great time. It's not fun. Going through a breakup or a divorce is not a fun time, even if it's the best option for you. So hoping that the relationship could improve, maintaining a sense of love for that person or loyalty for the person you've spent so much time with, those are all totally valid reasons why somebody might choose to stay. Other reasons that some of these that y'all have mentioned, others that you didn't, are listed here. So intimidation and fear for one's life and their safety. That it's actually quite risky for someone to leave an abusive relationship. We know that the first 2 weeks after somebody has chosen to leave their abuser is actually the most lethal time in the relationship for them. Why might that be?
I think just retaliation from the abuser.
Right, so
And wanting to get back.
Retaliation, wanting to get back, so having, some anger and resentment. And additionally, if we go back to that power and control slide, we know that the abusive person wants power and control. If someone has left the relationship, that person has lost power and control over their victim. So it all goes back to that. So intimidation and fear are super valid reasons why people choose to stay or return. We mentioned a lack of resources. We've mentioned hope. We've mentioned isolation and victim blaming. We've kind of touched on the system, and by the system, I do mean, the arduous process that it may take for somebody to obtain a domestic violence protective order, or in North Carolina to get a divorce, or custody orders. Going back to the original slide that we talked about, our statistics, that's a lot of times for someone to go to court against somebody who's probably using tactics to make them feel afraid and uncertain. So there are so many reasons why somebody might choose to stay or return, and so many reasons why it takes on average 7 times for someone to leave the abusive relationship for the relationship to actually be over. So again, I bring this up because I want us to have empathy for the survivors in our community, and never to question why it took someone so long to leave, because we know that leaving is a process and it's not an event. It's not safe for someone to just up and leave, because again, we've talked about the lethality aspect. We've talked about where might they go. Survivors have to make a plan before they're able to exit the relationship. And that's where community members and OASIS can come in. We can make a safety plan with folks. We can, as community members, making sure that they know that OASIS is in existence, and knowing that you are a safe and supportive person for them. So again, this slide is largely to break down those harmful misconceptions and stigma against survivors, so that we can reduce the shame that's associated with experiencing this form of violence. And that way we can make sure that our community members are getting services they need. Some other considerations that we have to contend with in this area is the rural settings. We know that in rural settings, support services may be limited. We're so lucky in Watauga County specifically to have a compassionate community that's full of nonprofit agencies and full of advocates. We are so lucky to have that. However, there are transportation barriers in Watauga County. There are other barriers for folks actually accessing those services. And then when we expand our scope outside of Watauga County, with the knowledge that OASIS serves both Watauga and Avery counties, we have to consider those support services may be limited. The transportation barriers are relevant, especially in our rural mountainous region. We also know that small towns or close-knit communities may be able to actually increase the shame and the stigma for survivors. If somebody is experiencing abuse from somebody who's, a big player in a small knit community, that survivor may not be able to safely leave. It may be able to actually increase the danger levels. Why might it increase danger for a survivor if we're talking about a small knit community?
I know I've had this a lot in the families that I've worked with where everybody knows everybody. And so they know when you're at this person's house or that person's house, it's much harder to keep yourself concealed and much easier for people to find you, just like word of mouth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that is a huge reason why it may increase danger, because if you're living in a close-knit community, there's only a certain few places where you might go. So this could actually increase danger for survivors. However, it can also be a resiliency factor. So I really want to bring that up, especially in this setting. Why might living in a rural setting or a small town or a close-knit community may be a resiliency factor for survivors? Well, so I'm just going to say it. It's because of groups like this, right? Because of groups like the Watauga Compassionate Community Initiative, because of the university asking OASIS to come speak on campus, because of the LEAD program in our community, because of all of the law enforcement officers who seek out information about OASIS and how to better serve our community related to these forms of violence. It's actually could be a resiliency factor, because when we form a community of like-minded individuals who have all settled on the fact that violence is not acceptable, and it's not only physical, and we may not know it's happening, but we know we can be an ally and a support person, then that's a small community that has enveloped survivors, right? Has kind of wrapped their arms around them and said, what happened to you is not okay. We believe you, and here's how you can access services. So it can actually be a really, really beautiful thing as well. And so moments like these where we're having this conversation and further conversations on down the line, this word of mouth aspect that we have in these small communities is really, really key when it comes to ending violence and supporting survivors. So on the one hand, it might create some barriers for survivors, but on the other hand, we have this beautiful opportunity to uplift survivors and ensure that support services are made available and clear. Another consideration that we, of course, always have to talk about is COVID-19. We know that due to the pandemic, there are certain factors on the power and control wheel that actually could have been amplified. What might those factors be, if you can remember the power and control wheel?
Isolation.
Absolutely. Isolation was a huge one, especially early in the pandemic when we had our stay-at-home orders. The catchphrase was, safer at home. That's absolutely true when we're trying to stop a virus. It's absolutely not true if you live with your abuser. And so the isolation piece may be amplified as well. What are some other pieces of the power and control wheel that could have sharpened the abuser's tools in their toolkit, so to speak?
The economic impact.
Yes, absolutely. So the economic abuse factor is hugely related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people lost their jobs during this pandemic. Many people had to become stay-at-home parents. This is so related to economic abuse and economic control. We know that if somebody has had to, lose their job and they're relying on the abusive party's income, it becomes even harder for them to leave. And it becomes much easier for the abuser to gain control in the relationship. So really, if we look at the power and control wheel, we know that so many of these aspects actually were amplified due to COVID. And I wish that we could spend more time on it because it's so relevant. And so this can increase barriers for survivors accessing support. If an office that they need to be in is closed for some reason, if, for example, a shelter that serves them had to reduce their capacity, These are so many things that are relevant in this work that we do need to, keep an eye on. The good news is that as an agency at OASIS and other agencies across the state, when this all started, we kind of put our heads together. How can we make sure survivors can access services? How can we make sure that people, while they may be at an increased risk of danger, still know that they can get our services? So during this pandemic, OASIS shelter remained open. And when we were at capacity for shelter, we found other creative solutions to make sure that people could get shelter if they needed it, if they were fleeing. We also were able to work together with legal aid and the Watauga County courts to make sure that folks could get domestic violence protective orders virtually. So these are some really innovative and creative strategies that we've been able to do to ensure that survivors can still get services. And I want to bring this back to this resiliency factor. These things would not have been possible without this small community that we're in caring about survivors. Because if this wasn't a consideration in our community, those creative strategies would have been much harder to execute. So I'm really proud to say that we were able to maintain services, and that's largely thanks to our community. Not to mention some federal funding, which we all know about. I want to briefly touch on intimate partner violence and mental health, and I say briefly because I anticipate that y'all have a very good understanding of a lot of this, but it is relevant because we know that that mental health can be used against survivors, especially when it comes to being in court or accessing services. Sometimes when a survivor has experienced certain types of physical violence, they may have traumatic brain injuries, memory loss, and of course, all of the post-traumatic stress disorders and things like that that can come along with experiencing trauma. Those things can make it difficult to access services. They can also make it difficult for a survivor to stand up alone in court and get the outcome that they deserve. Again, that is why OASIS provides that judicial systems advocacy for our survivors and our clients. So we know that an abusive person may use their victim's mental health condition to discredit the victim, use it as a justification for the abuse. On the flip side, they also may use their own mental health conditions as a justification for abusing their partner. And that's really harmful for many reasons. First and foremost, we know that people who have experienced trauma themselves or have a mental health condition themselves may be at an increased risk of experiencing abuse. They also may be at an increased risk of perpetrating the abuse, but to use it as a justification is really harmful for folks who are experiencing mental health conditions and not being abusive. So we know that those things are related, but they are not the same and they are not caused by one another. We have to be really careful about the way we talk about those things. And then some quick statistics. We know that survivors of intimate partner violence are more likely to have PTSD or major depressive disorders or engage in self-harm. They may be more likely to attempt suicide, and they are significantly more likely to experience substance abuse disorders. Why are those things relevant? Why am I bringing those things up today?
As the harm goes on past the incident.
Yes, absolutely. So we often talk about intimate partner violence as being a cycle of violence. And that's not to say that, some people talk about it in the way that the relationship and the actual abuse is cyclical. But what I'm meaning there is that it's a cycle of violence because if someone experiences intimate partner violence, they may have negative mental health outcomes that may increase the likelihood that they may become violent at some point in their own lives, or that they may experience violence again from an intimate partner. So it is, thank you, Denise, a cycle of violence. We also know that if somebody has witnessed intimate partner violence as a child, they are more likely to experience or perpetrate. And this is a statistic that is honestly such a challenge to discuss. There's so many pieces to tease out. I will say, I am a child witness and I see myself as a cycle breaker. I have witnessed intimate partner violence And I know that my parents witnessed it themselves. I know that their parents witnessed it. And so for me, this title that I've, bestowed on myself as a cycle breaker is so relevant to the statistic that I heard early on in life, that if somebody witnesses intimate partner violence, they may be more likely to perpetrate it or experience it themselves. That terrified me as a child. I did not want to be somebody who caused harm. And so for me, that was a moment of, okay, so, I have to really be thoughtful in my relationships and not fall back on those coping skills that I witnessed. However, it can paint people in boxes in ways that are really harmful. And so it's always a yes and conversation, always, 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 but leaning more on the resiliency factors and leaning more on the empowerment of at any moment, someone can change their behavior. And at any moment, a cycle can be broken. Not to say it's as easy, but to say that we have power in our own lives and in our own relationships is really, really key. And so I do just want to touch on that and just really emphasize that that statistic is accurate and it is relevant, and it needs to be paired with an empowering understanding that it's not a sentence, it's not a death sentence, so to speak. It is just a statistic. So oftentimes when I go through the intimate partner violence 101 thing, people tend to feel a little hopeless and thinking, geez, well, this is a huge problem. What can we do about it? How can we stop this? How can we make sure that our community is a safe place? Well, I'll tell you. First and foremost, again, going back to the resiliency factors, we have got to believe survivors. That sounds really simple. It's a tagline. It's on our masks and our buttons and our stickers. And people are like, yeah, believe survivors. But that is actually sometimes looks a little different for folks in practice, because we know that when we say believe survivors, that means you may have to believe somebody. You may have to believe your friend who is saying that your other friend is abusive. You may have to believe your son when he is telling you that he is experiencing abuse from his partner who you love. You may have to make some really challenging choices when it comes to believing survivors. So it's not just a tagline. It's got to be a way of life, right? It has to be this dialectical understanding that we can love someone very much and see the beautiful parts of them, and also know that they can inflict harm. So believing survivors is not as easy as just, getting a sticker from OASIS. We also know that we need to listen actively, but don't push. So there's a difference between, when you're engaging in conversation with survivors and saying, wow, is there any way I can support you? Or that sounds really hard, that kind of, thing. And saying, well, what happened then? What happened next? So kind of maintaining that in that moment when somebody may have disclosed to you that you're the person who they are looking to for support. And so listening actively is really key, but not pushing towards, okay, well, what are you going to do next? And what's your decision? And that kind of a thing. Engaging in informed consent. This is especially relevant if you hold power over the survivor. So that means if you are someone who works at the university and you may have to report what they've told you to Title IX, letting them know that early in the conversation so that they don't kind of share their whole experience. And at the end you say, all right, well, now I got to go make a report. That can feel really icky for folks. And so acknowledging in the moment, do I have power over this person's situation? And if I do, how can I make sure that I don't, use it in a harmful way, potentially? Going to therapy yourself and learning healthy coping skills and modeling healthy behaviors and relationships, really key in ending intimate partner violence in our communities, because the more folks who we see modeling healthy behaviors, the more we all can realize like healthy relationships are possible. That's really important for people like myself who consider themselves a cycle breaker. Witnessing other healthy relationships has been paramount in my ability to have one of my own, because I didn't see that growing up. So considering what does a healthy relationship mean to you, also relevant to that statement. Letting people know about OASIS. So never saying, okay, well, you have to call OASIS, you have to. But instead saying, gosh, that sounds really hard. And honestly, I'm worried for your safety. I want you to know that I know of some resources whenever you're ready, and I'll call them with you. You know, kind of walking by that person and knowing that you do know of resources. Also being aware that you can call us even as somebody who wouldn't be a client of ours, but saying, hey, I've got this friend and I really need some support about how to talk to them about what's going on in their lives. Can y'all help me with that? Absolutely, we can. We will absolutely talk to friends and family members and just say, you know, here are some skills that you can use whenever you're engaging in these conversations, and so on and so forth. Continuing to educate yourselves and those around you. So I believe that y'all are probably already doing that. It's a great job. And then of course supporting OASIS. So in order to do that, I want y'all to know plenty about OASIS, and then we can discuss Domestic Violence Awareness Month and all the things that are going on related to our agency and our services. So the most important part about all of this is to note that our services are always free and are always confidential. So, you know, we're never going to charge somebody for using our services, and we are strict about confidentiality. So safety is paramount for us. So that's the point there. We serve people regardless of their gender identity, their sexuality, their immigration status, English language ability, etc. A lot of times if I go out into the community and I say, oh, I work for OASIS, people will say, oh, the women's shelter. It's like, kind of, but not exactly. Because we don't only serve women, because anyone can experience intimate partner violence. We offer services outside of only our shelter model. So as you can see, we have a myriad of services here. So the shelter program is a free confidential emergency shelter, meaning that someone who is actively fleeing intimate partner violence or sex trafficking is eligible for our shelter program. Confidential is to say that it's at an undisclosed location. We work really hard to make sure it's a secure area. Aside from that shelter program, we offer a lot of other housing programs, so transitional and permanent supportive, information and referrals, case management, safety planning, and then those forms of advocacy that we have been over. And then of course, prevention and education, which is what I'm doing now. I know that y'all know my coworker, Kelly. She is super engaged in WCCI, and she is our prevention person, and she does an amazing job with our community. So there's a lot of different options for survivors when it comes to our services. And if you're not sure if somebody would qualify for our services or what they might fit into, still have them call us, because if we can't provide a service for them, it's likely that we know who can. And so we'll get them connected and make sure that referral process is smooth. And so that is my presentation on intimate partner violence and OASIS services. And so I want to talk briefly about Domestic Violence Awareness Month and what we've got going on this month, and then I can answer any questions y'all may have for me. So every October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we, you know, pre-COVID would have a lot of, you know, community workshops and fundraising events and things like that. And now that COVID is happening and it's not, you know, the best option for people to gather, not virtually, we've kind of had to trim some of those things back. So right now what we're doing is bringing around a lot of information and swag bags around to restaurants and community partners, things like that. If you have not gotten a swag bag for DVAM and you want one, I want you to reach out to me, because I'll make sure it happens. And so you can email me at scrouch@oasisinc.org. That's my first initial and my last name. And I can put that in the chat as well. So if you want that and you have not gotten that yet, please let me know. Those bags include things like OASIS rack cards, some stickers, some purple ribbons, and things like that. So please go ahead and reach out if that's something that you might want. in addition to doing those types of things, we do have some general workshops for some community groups and student groups that we're going to do. And we've got some fundraising events coming up at the end of the month, which will be on our social media. And then we also might be having a book club with Foggy Pine at the beginning of November. So folks can read the book during October, and then we would meet at the beginning of November. That's still TBD, so make sure that you follow us on Facebook and Instagram, or reach out to me directly if you want more information on that. I'd be happy to share. And all of that is to say that we don't have a ton of stuff going on this DVAM, and we know that we can raise awareness during any month. It doesn't have to be during October. But if you want to host an event, if you want to host a workshop, or get engaged, I really want y'all to follow us. Reach out to us via email, or I'm putting our social media handles in the chat as well. So those are some ways that you can get involved this DVAM, just sharing information, making sure that people know about OASIS and that it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So with all of that being said, we have a couple more minutes, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all may have, or open up a discussion or anything like that.
Sarah, you mentioned the purple ribbons. I know in the past y'all have brought around, if anybody doesn't know what that is, it's a little ribbon that you wear on your shirt. And so that's something that we can get from y'all to wear throughout the month of October for Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Right.
So you put your email in the chat. If you want her to get you some ribbons, just email her and let you know. I've had handfuls given to me before, and pass them out all over school. So I assume y'all have a lot again this year.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to tell you, Sarah, you mentioned history of domestic violence in your family, and it reminded me of something that I saw one time that I wanted to share with you, that says, "You're in the business of breaking generational trauma. You are who your bloodline has been waiting for."
That is lovely. Yeah. That's really nice. And, I, of course, am very passionate about this work. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been working with OASIS for so long. And when this is, a personal story, but I don't care because this is a, great group. My grandmother is a wonderful woman. And of course, as I mentioned, she did experience intimate partner violence from my grandfather. And when he passed away, she wanted to use the money that was left to her to start a shelter for people who were also experiencing intimate partner violence. And that was her goal. And I didn't actually know that until I started with OASIS, and my mom told me this. But my grandma never got to do that because my aunt, who is now deceased, at the time was in active addiction. And in order for her to meet her needs in that way, she actually stole that money. And so my grandma did not get to start the shelter that she hoped to. And so when I first started with OASIS, I remember calling my mom being like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can do this work with our history, our family history. And she told me that story, and it changed my opinion that I can do this work, because it's been years in the making. So that, I think, is a beautiful quote and reminded me of that. So thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's powerful. We got a few more minutes. Does anybody have anything they would like to tell Sarah, ask Sarah? So here's one thing I thought of. Frequently, I will have a mom in my office, or a dad, who will be talking about being the victim of violence. And I say, do you know about OASIS? Here's their number. But you said something about sitting with them while they call. So could I call here from my office and be like, hey, I'm sitting with this person. What do you want me to tell them? They're not ready to call you themselves, but we wanted to at least reach out. Is that something that happens sometimes?
That absolutely is something that happens sometimes. And yeah, plenty of times a community partner would be in the room with the survivor and wanting to get some more information for them, really so the survivor can hear it for themselves. Now, things that we won't do, we cannot take that person's phone number and just call them later. We won't be doing that. But But if the survivor wants to use the information they hear from us in that phone call and make the call themselves, they absolutely can. And yeah, that's, we call that in the biz a warm referral. So, just call in with them in the room, and so they can hear for themselves what kind of stuff we've got. And that, Denise, I think would encourage them too, because it can be scary for people to call by themselves. I've had folks come into our offices or call us before and say, I never thought I'd have to call you guys. I never thought I'd be here. Most people don't. And that's a big step, because once someone has called us or walked into our office, they have identified that they are, in fact, experiencing intimate partner violence. That is huge. That is a huge step. And so a way to bridge that gap and help them take that step or make it feel a little smaller might be to make that phone call with them, because you're just getting information.
Right.
It's not, it's not a whole life shift. You're just getting information.
Right. There's been a few comments in the chat. And so to people who are listening or on this call, if you do have something that you want to say to Sara, I'll copy and paste all the comments that are put here and send to her by email for her to read later when she's got time. One thing, thank you for emphasizing that the doors are open to all. Somebody else said they did a role play in one of her MSW classes of being a social worker and calling OASIS with the client, which is cool. The other question I wanted to ask you, Sara, I love the part about going to court with people. I also grew up in a domestic violence situation, and I can't tell you how many times my mom was resolute and went to court and saw him again, and then they were in the hall together afterwards, and it was just such a significant time of weakness and exposure. So I love that y'all go to court with people. Can somebody be involved with you and that be the only thing that they're getting from you, is that y'all are going to court with that person?
Absolutely. So we have a really awesome, one of my coworkers, her name is Ariel. She is our family justice advocate, and that is really her main role, is to work with clients who are going through the legal system, getting them connected with our community partners at Legal Aid, and making sure that they're able to navigate that system effectively and in the least traumatizing way possible. So yes, absolutely, people can access that service even if they're not, for example, in our shelter program or in a housing program.
Okay, great. All right, just a couple more minutes. If you have a comment or a question, let's see. This is from somebody who works with Appalachian Police, that says, having assisted individuals going through IPV situations in the civil process, I've always appreciated when OASIS meets the individual. It keeps not letting me read the last.
At court.
At court, yes.
Well, thank you. That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. And I am not surprised at all, because Ariel is on the ball. She's great.
Yeah, definitely a time you like to have somebody go with you. And I also think a lot of times, even when families seem like they understand what you're going through and are trying to be supportive, like they don't want to go to court with you. That is, you might feel support at home, but people don't want to get in the middle of that, and often are like, I support what you're doing, but I'm not going to court with you. So I just really feel like that's so important. Several things about how informative it is and helpful, and that we learn something new every time. So thank you so much, Sara, for being with us. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share with us before you go? I always ask this, and so I didn't tell you I was going to ask it, but I'm so interested in what people do to stay well. You have an intense job, and how you know when it's time to do the things that keep you well. So since we've got a minute, will you share a little bit about that with us?
Absolutely. And so I know that it's time for me to take some self-care when I'm being really hard on myself and feeling like nothing I ever do is enough. Because, as I'm sure most people in this situation know, being in a helping profession, there's always one more thing that could have gotten done. There's always one more person that could have been reached. And I know for myself that whenever I start focusing on that one more that could have but didn't, it's time for me to take a break. And so for me, I incorporate, self-care into my life by I take a lot of walks. You can find me most days that are not pouring down the rain or the snow at the Greenway at some point in the day. I also do a lot of pottery. So I'm a potter that's not very good, but I do it. And it is a great way for me to get some creative energy out. I'm so happy to say I have a really wonderful and supportive partner who takes on a lot of the daily life logistics whenever I'm just too brain fried to do it. So having that support person is awesome too.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. All right, well, it's about 5 till, so we're gonna let people sign off, go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, pet an animal before your next thing. Sarah put her email in the chat, but if you want to get her and you missed that, I'm sure she's happy for you to call OASIS and ask for her directly. So thanks, Sarah. We appreciate you being with us today and sharing all this really important information. We appreciate so much what y'all do there. Frequently people say to me, I don't know how you do what you do, but I frequently say that about what y'all do is very difficult and very intense. So thanks for doing it and doing it so well.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate y'all having me and hope y'all have a great week and eat some soup and watch some Halloween movies with this rain. So
that sounds great. All right. Thanks, Sarah. Everybody have a great rest of your day.